What happens when Hollywood's most laid-back actor meets late-night television's sharpest tongue, and a simple interview spirals into the most uncomfortable television moment in recent memory? Tonight, we're diving deep into the explosive confrontation that left audiences speechless and network executives scrambling for damage control. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets more intense with every passing minute. And you won't believe how far this situation escalated before the cameras finally stopped rolling. It started like any other Tuesday night taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The studio audience was buzzing with anticipation as they waited for the evening's guest, Matthew McConaughey, to make his entrance. The Oscar-winning actor was supposed to be promoting his latest environmental documentary, a passion project he'd been working on for 3 years about ocean conservation. What nobody expected was that this routine promotional appearance would turn into television history for all the wrong reasons. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his quick wit and occasionally biting humor, had prepared what he thought were standard interview questions. The show's producers had briefed him on McConaughey's talking points, his recent charitable work, and the key messages about the documentary. Everything seemed perfectly choreographed for another smooth late-night interview that would give the actor a platform to discuss his latest venture, while entertaining the audience with his signature philosophical musings. But from the moment McConaughey walked onto that stage, something felt different. His usual relaxed demeanor seemed more intense than usual, his eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there in previous appearances. The audience gave him their typical warm welcome, applauding as he made his way to the guest chair, flashing that famous smile that had charmed moviegoers for decades. Yet there was an underlying tension in his movements, a subtle shift in his energy that only became apparent in hindsight. Jimmy opened with his standard greeting, welcoming McConaughey back to the show and mentioning how great it was to see him again. The actor responded with his characteristic drawl, thanking Jimmy for having him, and settling into the chair with what appeared to be his usual comfort. The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected, with Jimmy asking about the documentary, and McConaughey explaining his passion for ocean conservation with genuine enthusiasm. However, the tone began to shift when Jimmy, perhaps thinking he was being playful, made a comment about McConaughey's well-documented love of the beach and how convenient it must be to combine his personal interests with his professional projects. It was meant to be a light-hearted observation, the kind of gentle ribbing that's standard fare for late-night television. But McConaughey's response was unexpectedly sharp. Instead of laughing along or deflecting with humor, the actor's expression hardened slightly. He looked directly at Jimmy and said that his environmental work wasn't about convenience or personal preference, but about genuine concern for the planet's future. The words came out measured and deliberate, carrying a weight that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jimmy, sensing the change in atmosphere, tried to backtrack with a quick clarification, but McConaughey wasn't letting it slide. The conversation continued, but now there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there moments before. Every question Jimmy asked seemed to be met with increasingly pointed responses from McConaughey, who appeared to be reading subtext into comments that were likely meant to be innocuous. When Jimmy made another attempt at humor, suggesting that McConaughey's philosophical approach to life must make him popular at Hollywood parties, the actor's jaw visibly tightened. McConaughey leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a different quality as he responded that maybe the problem with Hollywood, and by extension with media in general, was that people couldn't have serious conversations about serious topics without everything being turned into entertainment. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Jimmy found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to navigate a conversation that was rapidly moving away from the light entertainment format his show was known for. The studio audience, sensing the growing tension, had gone noticeably quieter. What had started as enthusiastic applause and laughter was now replaced by an almost palpable uncertainty. People in the front rows could be seen exchanging glances, unsure whether they were witnessing an authentic moment of conflict or some kind of elaborate setup for a joke that hadn't landed yet. Jimmy, to his credit, tried to steer the conversation back toward safer ground by asking about McConaughey's upcoming film projects. But even this seemingly neutral territory became problematic when the host made an offhand comment about how actors often use environmental causes as a way to rehabilitate their public image after controversy. The comment was delivered with Jimmy's typical comedic timing, clearly meant to be a general observation about Hollywood rather than a specific accusation against his guest. But McConaughey didn't see it that way. His response was immediate and cutting, asking Jimmy directly whether he was suggesting that his 3 years of work on ocean conservation was nothing more than a publicity stunt. The question was delivered with such intensity that Jimmy actually stuttered slightly in his response, something that rarely happened to the seasoned late-night host. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees as McConaughey continued, his voice never rising but somehow becoming more commanding with each word. He asked Jimmy whether he had actually watched the documentary he was supposedly there to promote, or whether he was just reading questions off cards written by producers who hadn't bothered to understand the real issues being discussed. Jimmy's discomfort was becoming increasingly visible. His usual confident demeanor was being replaced by something approaching defensiveness as he tried to assure McConaughey that he had indeed reviewed the material and that his questions weren't meant to diminish the importance of environmental work. But the damage was already done, and McConaughey wasn't backing down. The actor began speaking more directly about what he saw as the fundamental problem with media coverage of serious issues. How everything gets reduced to sound bites and entertainment value rather than genuine engagement with important topics. His words were articulate and passionate, but they were also increasingly confrontational, delivered with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't just about the documentary anymore. As the commercial break approached, both men were locked in a staring contest that felt more appropriate for a courtroom than a late-night talk show. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure how to react to what they were witnessing. Jimmy's producers could be seen in the wings, frantically gesturing and undoubtedly trying to figure out how to salvage what was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. The commercial break couldn't come fast enough, but everyone in that studio knew that when they returned, something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between host and guest, and there was no going back to the comfortable, predictable format that late-night television audiences expected. When the cameras stopped rolling for the commercial break, the tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jimmy's producers rushed onto the stage, their faces showing the kind of panic that only comes when live television starts going very wrong very quickly. They huddled around Jimmy, speaking in urgent whispers, while McConaughey sat motionless in his chair, staring straight ahead with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. The lead producer, a woman who had been with the show for over a decade and had seen her share of difficult guests, approached McConaughey with the kind of diplomatic smile reserved for diffusing celebrity meltdowns. She gently suggested that maybe they could reset the conversation when they came back from break. Perhaps focus more on the lighter aspects of his work, maybe share some behind-the-scenes stories from the documentary filming that would give the audience something to laugh about. McConaughey turned his gaze toward her with the slow deliberation of a man who had made up his mind about something important. His response was quiet but unmistakable in its finality. He told her that he wasn't interested in performing for the audience's entertainment when there were real issues at stake, issues that deserved more than surface-level treatment and cheap laughs. The producer's smile faltered as she realized that her standard damage control tactics weren't going to work with this particular situation. Meanwhile, Jimmy was getting his own pep talk from his head writer, who was frantically scrolling through backup questions on his phone, trying to find anything that might steer the interview back into safer territory. The writer suggested they could pivot to talking about McConaughey's family, his Texas roots, or even his famous car commercials, anything that would get them away from the minefield they had somehow stumbled into. But Jimmy, perhaps feeling his professional pride wounded by how the interview had gone so far, shook his head. He told his writer that he wasn't going to let a guest hijack his show and turn it into a lecture hall. This was late-night television, not a documentary film festival, and if McConaughey couldn't handle a few playful questions without turning everything into a philosophical debate, then maybe he was on the wrong show. The stage manager was holding up fingers, counting down the seconds until they would be back on air. The audience, who had been chattering nervously during the break, gradually quieted down as they sensed the cameras were about to roll again. There was an electric anticipation in the air, the kind that comes when people know they might be witnessing something unprecedented. As the red light came back on and Jimmy's familiar smile returned to his face, he attempted to restart the conversation with a diplomatic tone. He acknowledged that environmental issues were indeed serious and important, and that he appreciated McConaughey's passion for the cause. It was a peace offering, a chance for both men to step back from the brink and return to the comfortable format that everyone expected. But McConaughey wasn't interested in peace offerings. Instead of accepting Jimmy's olive branch, he used it as an opportunity to go deeper into his critique of how media handles serious subjects. He began speaking about the responsibility that comes with having a platform, about how late-night television reaches millions of people who might never otherwise engage with environmental issues, and how that influence was being wasted on surface-level entertainment. Jimmy's smile became increasingly strained as McConaughey continued his monologue. The host tried several times to interject with questions or comments that would bring the conversation back to a more traditional interview format, but each attempt was smoothly deflected by the actor, who seemed determined to deliver his message. Regardless of the venue or the host's comfort level, the turning point came when Jimmy, perhaps feeling cornered and defensive, made a comment about how actors often mistake having a platform for having expertise. He suggested, with what he probably thought was gentle humor, that just because someone was good at memorizing lines and hitting their marks didn't necessarily make them qualified to lecture others about complex global issues. The words were barely out of Jimmy's mouth before he realized he had made a serious miscalculation. McConaughey's entire demeanor shifted in an instant, his casual posture straightening as his eyes locked onto Jimmy's with laser focus. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in that studio. When McConaughey finally spoke, his voice carried a controlled anger that was somehow more intimidating than if he had simply exploded. He asked Jimmy whether he thought 3 years of research, working with marine biologists, collaborating with environmental scientists, and documenting the actual effects of ocean pollution qualified as just memorizing lines. His words were precise and cutting, delivered with the kind of intensity that made it clear this was no longer about entertainment or even about environmental issues, but about respect and credibility. Jimmy tried to backtrack, explaining that he hadn't meant to question McConaughey's dedication or the validity of his work, but his explanation only seemed to fuel the fire. McConaughey pointed out that this was exactly the problem, that people in media felt comfortable making dismissive comments about serious work and then trying to laugh it off when called out on it. The actor began detailing some of the specific research he had done for the documentary, describing conversations with scientists who had dedicated their entire careers to understanding ocean ecosystems, sharing statistics about coral reef destruction and marine life extinction rates that clearly demonstrated a deep understanding of the subject matter. His knowledge was impressive and his passion was undeniable, but the way he was delivering this information felt more like a cross-examination than a friendly chat. Jimmy found himself in the uncomfortable position of being educated on live television by a guest who was clearly better prepared than he was. The host's usual quick wit seemed to abandon him as he struggled to find responses that wouldn't further escalate the situation. Every attempt at humor fell flat. Every effort to redirect the conversation was met with more pointed criticism about the media's treatment of important issues. The studio audience had gone completely silent now, watching this unprecedented confrontation unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some people in the front rows were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and looking around as if seeking permission to leave. Others seemed transfixed by the raw authenticity of what they were witnessing, so different from the carefully scripted entertainment they had expected. McConaughey continued his critique, expanding from environmental issues to a broader discussion of how celebrity culture and media sensationalism were contributing to the dumbing down of public discourse. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with influence, about how platforms like Jimmy's show could be used to elevate important conversations instead of reducing everything to entertainment value. Jimmy, perhaps realizing that his usual tactics weren't working, tried a different approach. He attempted to turn the tables by suggesting that McConaughey was being unfair, that late-night television had always been about entertainment first, and that expecting a comedy show to serve as a serious documentary forum was unrealistic. It was a reasonable point, delivered with what Jimmy probably thought was justified defensiveness. But McConaughey wasn't buying it. He pointed out that Jimmy regularly had politicians, authors, and activists on his show to discuss serious topics, so the precedent for meaningful conversation was already established. The difference, he suggested, was that Jimmy seemed to think some guests deserved serious treatment while others, apparently including environmental activists who happened to be actors, were fair game for dismissive humor. The conversation had now moved completely away from the documentary that McConaughey was supposed to be promoting. Instead, it had become a real-time deconstruction of media practices, celebrity culture, and the intersection of entertainment and social responsibility. The irony was not lost on anyone present that this serious discussion about the need for serious discussions was happening on a show known for comedy sketches and celebrity games. As the segment continued, it became clear that neither man was going to back down. Jimmy's professional pride was clearly wounded, while McConaughey seemed energized by the opportunity to finally express frustrations that had apparently been building for some time. The collision of these two strong personalities, each defending their own territory, was creating television that was uncomfortable, unpredictable, and utterly compelling. The producers in the wings were making increasingly frantic gestures, but both the host and guest seemed to have forgotten that this was supposed to be entertainment. They were locked in a battle of wills that had taken on a life of its own, with no clear resolution in sight and no easy way to restore the comfortable dynamic that late-night television depends on. The moment that would define this entire confrontation came when Jimmy, clearly frustrated by his inability to regain control of his own show, made what would prove to be a fatal mistake. In an attempt to reassert his authority and perhaps inject some levity back into the situation, he decided to make a joke about McConaughey's famous Lincoln car commercials, suggesting that maybe the actor should stick to selling luxury vehicles instead of trying to save the world. The comment landed like a bomb in the already tense atmosphere. McConaughey's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He stood up from his chair so abruptly that it rolled backward several feet, his 6-foot frame towering over Jimmy, who remained seated behind his desk. The actor's face had transformed completely, any trace of his usual laid-back demeanor replaced by something approaching fury. McConaughey's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and dangerous, carrying an edge that nobody in that studio had ever heard from him before. He told Jimmy that he had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that making jokes about someone's professional work while they were trying to discuss literally life-and-death issues showed exactly the kind of moral bankruptcy that was destroying meaningful discourse in this country. Jimmy, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, tried to laugh it off, suggesting that McConaughey was taking things too seriously, and that they should probably move on to talking about something else. But the damage was done, and McConaughey wasn't interested in moving on. Instead, he began what could only be described as a full-scale verbal assault on everything Jimmy represented. The actor spoke with the kind of articulate rage that comes from someone who has been holding back their true feelings for far too long. He told Jimmy that he represented everything wrong with modern media, that his show was a perfect example of how important issues get trivialized, and reduced to punchlines, for the entertainment of people who would rather laugh than think. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut as deeply as possible. Jimmy's face had gone pale as he realized that this situation was completely beyond his control. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by something approaching panic as he watched his carefully crafted show persona crumble under McConaughey's relentless criticism. The host tried several times to interrupt, to redirect, to somehow regain the upper hand, but McConaughey steamrolled over every attempt. The studio audience was now witnessing something that felt more like a public execution than a television interview. Some people had actually started to leave, quietly gathering their belongings and heading for the exits, unable to handle the intensity of what they were seeing. Others remained frozen in their seats, transfixed by the raw authenticity of the moment, knowing they were watching something that would be talked about for years to come. McConaughey continued his critique, expanding his attack to include the entire late-night television format, the culture of celebrity worship, and what he called the systematic dumbing down of American discourse. He spoke about how shows like Jimmy's created the illusion of engagement with serious issues while actually preventing any real understanding or action. His words were eloquent, passionate, and absolutely devastating in their accuracy. Jimmy, desperate to salvage some dignity from the situation, made one final attempt to fight back. He pointed out that McConaughey was a guest on his show, that he had come there voluntarily, and that if he didn't like the format, he was free to leave. It was meant to be a power play, a reminder of who was in charge, but it backfired spectacularly. McConaughey's response was swift and final. He told Jimmy that he was absolutely right, that he didn't have to stay and be part of what he called a circus designed to distract people from the real problems facing the world. He began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and unhurried, making it clear that he was leaving on his own terms. Jimmy, realizing that his attempt to regain control had only made things worse, tried to convince McConaughey to sit back down, to finish the interview like professionals. But the actor was done listening. He told Jimmy that professionalism worked both ways, that treating serious subjects with respect was part of being professional, and that he had no interest in participating in what he called intellectual vandalism. The tension in the studio had reached an almost unbearable level. The producers were now openly visible in the wings, frantically trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Some were gesturing toward the cameras, others were speaking rapidly into headsets, but everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. As McConaughey finished removing his microphone and prepared to leave, Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He called out to the actor, trying to frame his departure as an overreaction, suggesting that they had just been having a spirited discussion and that there was no need for anyone to storm off. But his words only seemed to further infuriate McConaughey. The actor turned back toward Jimmy with a look that could have melted steel. He told the host that calling this a spirited discussion was like calling a mugging a friendly conversation, that Jimmy's attempt to minimize what had happened was exactly the kind of gaslighting that allowed serious problems to be ignored while everyone pretended everything was fine. McConaughey then did something that nobody expected. Instead of simply walking off stage, he turned to address the studio audience directly, speaking to them as if Jimmy wasn't even there. He told them that they deserved better than what they were getting from their media, that they were being sold entertainment disguised as information, and that real change would only come when people demanded substance over spectacle. His impromptu speech to the audience was passionate and compelling, delivered with the kind of authenticity that made it impossible to dismiss as celebrity grandstanding. He spoke about the importance of critical thinking, about the need to engage with difficult topics even when they weren't entertaining, about the responsibility that everyone had to be informed citizens rather than passive consumers of whatever content was being fed to them. Jimmy, meanwhile, sat behind his desk looking like a man who had just watched his career implode in real time. His attempts to interrupt McConaughey's speech were ignored. His gestures toward the cameras were futile, and his entire carefully constructed television persona had been exposed as inadequate for dealing with genuine conflict or authentic emotion. The final blow came when McConaughey, having finished his address to the audience, turned back to Jimmy one last time. He told the host that he hoped someday Jimmy would understand the difference between being clever and being wise, between getting laughs and making a difference, and between having a platform and deserving one. The words were delivered with such quiet intensity that they seemed to echo in the silent studio long after they were spoken. As McConaughey finally began walking toward the stage exit, Jimmy made one last desperate move. Whether it was wounded pride, genuine anger, or simply panic at watching his show disintegrate, he called out to security, suggesting that McConaughey was being disruptive and needed to be escorted out. It was the wrong move at the wrong time, and everyone in that studio knew it. McConaughey stopped walking and slowly turned back toward Jimmy, his expression showing a mixture of disappointment and contempt that was somehow more devastating than pure anger would have been. He told Jimmy that having him removed by security would be the perfect ending to their conversation, that it would prove every point he had made about how the media handles inconvenient truths. The security guards who had been summoned looked uncomfortable as they approached the stage, clearly unsure about physically removing an A-list celebrity who hadn't actually done anything wrong beyond speaking his mind. McConaughey made their job easier by raising his hands and walking toward them voluntarily, telling Jimmy that he didn't need to be dragged out because he was leaving willingly. As McConaughey was escorted off the stage, the studio fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was the actor's footsteps echoing through the space. Jimmy sat behind his desk looking shell-shocked, his usual quick wit completely abandoned, his confident smile replaced by something approaching devastation. The audience remained frozen in their seats, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the aftermath, every second of the uncomfortable silence that followed McConaughey's departure. Jimmy eventually managed to mumble something about going to commercial break, but his words lacked any of their usual energy or conviction. He looked like a man who had just realized that his entire career might have been built on foundations far less solid than he had believed. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become something unprecedented in television history, a raw and unfiltered confrontation between two worldviews that couldn't coexist in the same space. The aftermath would be felt for months to come, but in that moment, everyone in the studio understood that they had witnessed something that would be talked about, analyzed, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling.